In part 9, we are going to take a look at CSS3 gradients. So let's come back to TextMate, and here's where we left off in part 8, where you learned about border radius, box shadow, and text shadow. Now we're going to move on to gradients. So let's say I want to change this kind of grayish color right now to be a little more appealing, and we're going to use a gradient. So let's go in here, and I'm going to find a color. We started with 666, and why don't we then actually, we'll just grab one of these colors. We'll start here, and we want to end just a little bit lower. We don't want to do anything too extreme, maybe right around there. All right. So let's save that, and we know we want to go from this color to this color. So the way we can do this is first we set a default color for the browsers that don't understand gradients, like Internet Explorer. So that color will be the first value. Next, we're going to take care of Mozilla. Unfortunately, the syntax, like it is for box shadow and border radius, is not the same for Firefox and Safari, or Mozilla and WebKit. So we'll begin with, let's begin with WebKit. We're going to do WebKit, we're going to do background, and this is going to be equal to WebKit gradient. So it accepts a handful of parameters. The first one it wants to know is what kind of gradient. Is it a radial gradient? Is it a linear? It's going to be linear. And now it wants to know what are the coordinates of where it's going to begin. Okay, well, we want it to begin pretty much from top to bottom. So we can say this gradient is going to go from the very top left to the very bottom left. All right, so let's do that right now. Left top to left bottom. Okay, so all you're pretty much just saying is right up here and then all the way down here. Now it wants to know where should it begin. So WebKit, we have these functions available to us called color stop. And with color stop, you set the value of where you want it to stop, so maybe 0.5, red, okay. And then you could do a comma, and you could do another color stop, and this will be at 0.7 or 70% of the height. You could do green. But in addition to color stop, there are some helper functions available for from and to accordingly. So we could do from red to green. And notice that I have a comma between those. From, and then comma, and then to, and then the last parenthesis is the closing one from up here. So if I save that and I refresh the page, now we have, whoops, from red to green. Let's get rid of that. And I'm sorry, I did left top. Let's change that to bottom. Come back, refresh the page, and now we have a very ugly gradient going from red to green. But now you get the idea. So let's do something a little more subtler, like we had before. And we're going to grab this gray color, paste it in, and then it's going to go to this next color. So hopefully you'll be able to see this on this resolution. Refresh the page, and now we have a very subtle gradient going from darker gray, and then it gets just a little bit lighter, adding a little bit of depth. So one that I often do is, let's go to the body. Let's do body, background, 666 instead. And then here we're going to set a gradient from E3, 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 and that's where we want it to end. So we're doing the same color to the same color, but that's okay. You can see where we're going there. And let's go ahead and change that color to black. Okay, so now all I wanted to do is briefly go to white and then go back to the grayish color. So I can say color stop in between. I can do as many of these as I want, and at 50% it should be at white. Save that, and now you can see it starts at that almost white color and then goes to white, and then it goes back to that color. Pretty neat. So you can be very flexible with how you want your gradients, and pretty much anything you do in Photoshop as far as a gradient, you can mimic here as long as you do the right color stops. So if we wanted the official version, instead of using this helper function, we could do color stop at 0 at this color, and then 2, change that to color stop. It's just a matter of what you prefer. At 1, and 1 would be at 100% of the height, and we're going to get the exact same thing. So if we wanted to change and we want it white at maybe 30%, and let's say we want it white from 30% to 70% of this box, we could do color stop 0.7 and keep that at white to make sure that it isn't already returning, because if we did not have this, right after it got to 30%, it would start changing back to this other color. So I'm going to say from 30% to 70%, keep it at white. but then move on to this color. And if I refresh, now you're going to see it's a very subtle difference. Hopefully you can see this on this resolution, but that's the key. Don't make your gradients too intense. Make them subtle where almost you can't even tell. So, and then of course, if you want to add even another layer, you could do something like a border top. In this case, solid white. And it makes it pop out just a little bit more, and I'd want to get rid of the box shadow in this case. And you can see just adding that little white strip at the top just adds an extra layer of depth to your projects. Okay, so I'll go ahead and bring that back and get rid of the border. That's not necessary. But, so we have this. Let's go back to Firefox, refresh the page, and not really what we wanted, right? And that's because Mozilla doesn't understand WebKit prefixes ever. Mozilla will never understand what this means. So we need to go ahead and do something that Mozilla does understand. Background, Moz, and in Mozilla's case, that's definitely not how you spell it. In Mozilla's case, we're going to put linear into the actual name. So Moz linear gradient. Okay. So it wants to know, a lot of people prefer Mozilla's syntax, just incidentally. So it wants to know, where is it going to begin? It's going to begin at the top. And it's going to be assumed that it's going from the bottom. And then it wants to know two more parameters. What's the beginning color? What's the end color? So let's change this red, as we did before. Go to Firefox, refresh the page, and now we get that same horrendous gradient. But now we can work with this. We can go ahead and start pasting in these values. So if I say begin at E3, 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 and go to white, we get that initial value that we had. But we can do color stops the same way, but rather than doing it like a function format, we can pass in a value. So let's keep it with these obnoxious colors just so you can see it a little better. And we're going to say green, and rather than doing 0.5 for 50%, we would do 50%, and then yellow. So if I refresh the page, what you're seeing here is that it starts at red, and then by the time it gets to 50% of the height, which will be right around here, it needs to be 100% green. And then from that 50% mark, you continue on to yellow. So if I wanted to say yellow, continue on to 75%, and then, sorry, yellow at 75%. Notice I'm not having a comma between these values. All right, so yellow at 75%, and then continue on to black, for example. All right, so now you've got red to green at 50%, to yellow, you can see that line perfectly for 75%, then continues on to black. Okay, so let's go ahead and substitute the values from up here so that we get a consistent gradient. So we begin at red, I'm sorry, at this grayish color, and then at 30% it should be white. So white at 30%, and then continuing on, at 70% it should be white as well. So 70%, make sure we add that as white, and then finally it goes back to that grayish color. Save that. And now if I bring up Safari as well, we get the exact same gradient. Really neat. So yes, it is a big pain in the butt, to be honest, but we can make it work. So if you want something a little bit easier, Paul Irish and, sorry, I can't remember the other person, they built this site called CSS3 Please. So what this does is it kind of makes it easier for us. You can play around with the values, and this box right here will reflect the values that you can change. So at css3please.com, you can change the yellow. So if I want to change this to 5, it's going to update all the values, which you can then just kind of click and copy, bring them into your project, and you immediately have those available to you. So you see if I change this to 30 pixels, it's going to be updated accordingly. So 10. All right, you get the idea. And the same thing's for box shadow. So if you know that you want to apply a border radius of 2 pixels or a box shadow, maybe it's quicker for you. Just come to CSS3 Please, go ahead and set your values, 1 pixel, 1 pixel, and then maybe 2 pixels worth of blur. If it'll let me update this, there we go. And then we can set our color, and that'll update all of them. I click and copy that, and it's going to be a little bit quicker to do. Now, what they do offer, which is even more so helpful, is the gradients. And not only because Internet Explorer does not understand these CSS3 gradients, a lot of people don't know is Internet Explorer has actually had support for gradients since Internet Explorer 6. But because, as you can see here, the filter, they're called filters that you use, they're so complicated that nobody ever took the time to use them because it was just kind of a nightmare to remember. But they've set it up so we can set, let's say in our example, we had our basic example, we had this one to white. And this will go ahead and update every single one. So this will support Firefox 3.6. This one will support WebKit for Safari 4 and Chrome. And then we have IE6 and IE7, and then IE8 implemented -ms. That's their vendor prefix, -filter. So you could just take all of this, come back, and let's go ahead and replace. And there you go. And then you might want to set a background. Last effort, background of white. And then you have all of your effects, and they go ahead and add the commenting if you need to come back and you can't exactly remember what each of these is for. So css3please.com is a great site. Be sure to use it. And now you can implement gradients into all of your websites.